Today's colleges and universities are no longer the rough and tumble marketplace of ideas of a generation or two ago. Increasingly, they're about rigid orthodoxy. Some examples, in the past 2 or 3 years, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, Wall Street Journal editor Jason Riley, and nationally syndicated columnist George Will, and many more, have been disinvited to speak on college campuses. Outside campus, these are mainstream dignitaries. On campus, they're considered beyond the pale. Libertarian feminist Wendy McElroy was permitted to participate in a debate at Brown University in which she was expected to criticize the use of the over-the-top term rape culture. But Brown set aside for students a room for students who may be traumatized by allowing Ms. McElroy to speak on campus. The room was equipped with Play-Doh, calming music, pillows, blankets, and a video of frolicking puppies. At Emory and at DePaul University, chalking on the sidewalk was never considered to be much of a problem until somebody chalked Donald Trump's name, and then there was an uproar. No issue is too small to be noticed by the enforcers of orthodoxy. In today's university, if a student wears a kimono in a Halloween pageant, at best she can expect to be accused of cultural appropriation. Let me point out parenthetically that we'd all be walking around in bearskins today if it weren't for cultural appropriation. Imitation is not just the sincerest form of flattery. It is the way that 99% of all improvement in human lives occurs. But cultural appropriation is actually the best that our kimono-wearing student can expect. More likely, she will be told that her choice of Halloween costume shows that she is a racist or a sexist. My question here is, where is all this coming from? This isn't just students who make mistakes because they're young. It's universities themselves that are promoting stifling political correctness. So rather than training their students in a sense of detachment, something that's necessary in order to be able to grapple with difficult issues and an attempt to understand what other people are thinking and what they are trying to argue for, instead of promoting that sense of detachedness. Students are being encouraged to take offense on behalf of their group for even the most innocent of behaviors. Rather than treat the symptoms, I urge you to look for some of the underlying causes and supports for the current situation. Again, where is all this coming from? There are lots of answers to that question. I have time to mention only a few, and my expertise happens to lie in the area of race and sex law, and so that's what I will concentrate on. But that is where I think a very large bulk of the problem happens to lie. If we want to make the problem go away, we're going to have to grapple with these issues. First one I want to mention, racial preferences in admissions is a significant contributing factor to stultifying political correctness. Consider this. One consequence of widespread race preferences in admissions is that underrepresented minority students end up distributed among universities in very different patterns from their white or Asian counterparts. When the schools that are highest on the academic ladder relax their admission standards to admit more minority students, schools one rung down must do likewise if they're to have minority students. The problem is thus passed to the schools another rung down, which do the same. As a result, underrepresented minority students are concentrated at the bottom of most selective schools. That's not a hard and fast rule. There are always exceptions to that rule, but it is true of just about every selective university now. And the problem is not that there are no academically gifted minority students, but there are not currently enough at the very top tiers to satisfy the demand, and that efforts to change that have created a strange and unhealthy credentials gap up and down the pecking order. For example, we learned in connection with the Grutter and the Gratz cases, the cases against the University of Michigan before the Supreme Court 13 years ago, that gave Michigan underrepresented minority students a preference that amounted to an entire letter grade, all other things being equal. So African American and Hispanic students with a 3.0 average were treated as if they had a 4.0 average for the purposes of admission. This is no tiebreaker in otherwise close cases. The preferences are very large, and since 2003, when that case was decided, they've been getting larger. Alas, entering credentials matter. Students whose academic credentials are well below the average for a particular school usually earn grades to match. And while some students outperform their academic credentials, just as some students will underperform theirs, most students perform in the range that their academic credentials suggest. And no serious supporter of affirmative action denies this. The inevitable result is a campus culture where many minority students feel out of place. They feel like they have more in common with members of their own race at the school than they do with other students. It's easy to get prickly under those circumstances. It's easy to start thinking, hey, it's all politics, or my teachers are racist, and start demanding special safe spaces, start wanting separate dormitories, separate graduation ceremonies. Universities are on pins and needles over race issues because for almost half a century now, they've been designing their admissions process in a way that inevitably leads to that problem. Another related contributing factor to this campus culture is the diversity bureaucracy. And obviously these things are related. But these days, every university has all of them. A diversity dean, an associate dean in charge of outreach and inclusion, an assistant dean in charge of LGBT issues, a director of special student housing for African Americans, a director of women's studies in the area of science and engineering. There's lots and lots of this. We're not talking about a couple of $1 million dropped by each large university, but we're talking about tens of millions of dollars spent on issues of this sort. And in some respects, universities are victims of their own wealth. They can afford salaries for all these diversity bureaucrats, so they have them. But you can bet that if it's your job to find and to worry about race and sex discrimination, then one way or another, you're going to find that discrimination, even if you have to define sexism and racism down, sometimes way, way down. Only the hopelessly naive would expect that none of this would affect campus culture. Of course it does. Now, some of these administrators are actually required by law. The Department of Education has decreed that every school must have Title IX coordinators. And speaking of the Department of Education, let me point out that not all these administrators are actually on the payroll of the individual colleges and universities. Some of it's external. If you're wondering, why is it that the talk of, with all the talk of diversity, that somehow the institutions themselves are so non-diverse. Every university is the same as every other university, so little diversity among institutions. Why do they all walk in lockstep on so many issues? Well, for some, it's because they want to keep their accreditation. Accrediting agencies, for example, often require race preferential admissions policies, and some universities and some law schools have actually had their accreditation threatened because they were thought not to be engaging in enough in the way of racial preferences in admissions. So it's as simple as that. Dissenters will be threatened with de-accreditation. The Department of Education, of course, has its own internal bureaucracy on top of the accreditors who, at least in theory, are not part of part of the Department of Education. And to justify their existence, they've got to constantly redefine what race and what sex discrimination means. The latest requirement, of course, out of the Department of Education is the requirement that transgendered students, that is an anatomical male who nevertheless psychologically identifies with females and vice versa, students have to be given the opportunity to use the bathrooms, locker rooms, and showers of the group that they identify with rather than the group where their anatomy actually matches. And of course, this extends also to sports teams and to dormitories. It's not just the work of bureaucrats either. Congress and the courts have been a third very large contributing factor to the present situation. This one's really complicated, and I think that Michael's going to get too upset with me if I stay up here and try to explain that, because I'd have to go back into like the history of English courts and how courts of equity and courts of common law had very different traditions, and it's hard to believe, but that really has had a profound effect on this issue. We've gotten to the point since the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which was passed during the administration of George H.W. Bush, to where the law creates pressures on schools to adopt zero-tolerance rules that cause them to want to control what happens and what is said on campus in order to avoid lawsuits. That's a problem that's not going to be easy to fix. Weirdly, well, I won't even go into that. I'm going to let you knock me off the stage here because it would take me too long to explain it. It's going to be hard to fix some of these things, but we can't fool ourselves into believing that we're going to be able to fix it just by applying pressure to college administrators now. We've got some really serious problems that have to be fixed, and a lot of them are tightly wound up with the law. And so we got to start thinking about not just how we're going to put pressure on colleges and universities, but how we're going to put pressure on the levers of government. Do it is I can actually produce more African-American engineers, more African-American scientists, more African-American lawyers, more African-American college professors if students only went to the school where their academic credentials put them ballpark in the middle of the class. There is plenty of evidence that what is holding back African-American students is exactly race preferences, and yet people don't want to address that. They don't want to believe it. If there's a golden door here, all you got to do is open the door and walk through it. I can't make all the problems go away, but I can increase the number of black professionals by ensuring that people go to the school where their academic credentials put them ballpark in the middle or the upper part of the class.